Resource reckoning. The German industrial collapse. Every industrial collapse begins the same way, with something that should have been manageable, something that planners anticipated, something that contingency systems were designed to handle. But when the margin for error disappears, manageable becomes catastrophic, anticipated becomes impossible, and contingency systems become the mechanism of failure itself. On February 24th, 2022, European industry began dying, not from bombs, not from invasion, from a single pipeline valve closing 200 miles away. Within 18 months, Germany had shut down its last nuclear plants, watched energy costs multiply sevenfold, and witnessed the systematic exodus of industrial capacity that took 70 years to build. This wasn't energy policy failure. This wasn't geopolitical miscalculation. This was the industrial foundation of an empire crumbling in real time. And if you understand what happened to Germany, you understand what's happening to the entire Western industrial order. Because this pattern is not new. We've seen it before. The most productive economy in Europe doesn't simply collapse because gas prices spike. Industrial systems that survived 2 world wars don't evaporate because of supply chain disruptions, unless something deeper is breaking, unless the margins that held everything together were already gone. Let me show you what industrial death looks like when it happens slowly, systematically, inevitably. BASF, the world's largest chemical producer, announced in October 2022 that it would permanently shut down ammonia and fertilizer production in Europe. Permanently. These weren't temporary closures waiting for energy prices to normalize. These were permanent facility shutdowns, with production moving to China and the United States. ThyssenKrupp, Germany's largest steel producer, reduced capacity by 20% and eliminated 5,000 jobs. Bayer announced it would cut 12,000 positions globally, with most cuts concentrated in German operations. Siemens began relocating manufacturing operations outside Europe for the first time in its 175-year history. But the numbers tell a clearer story than corporate announcements. German industrial production fell 11% year over year by late 2022. Manufacturing PMI dropped to 44.1, indicating severe contraction. Energy-intensive sectors saw production collapse by 20-25%. These weren't cyclical downturns. These were structural breaks. When Volkswagen announced it was considering closing plants in Germany for the first time in its history, something fundamental had changed. When BMW began shifting electric vehicle production to China and Mexico, when Mercedes moved battery production to Alabama, these weren't optimization moves. These were evacuation decisions. Industrial capacity doesn't simply relocate. It migrates. From declining powers to rising ones, from expensive jurisdictions to competitive ones, from constraint to opportunity. And once it migrates, it doesn't return. This is how industrial empires die. Not through military conquest, through economic mathematics, through cost structures that make production impossible, through energy dependencies that become weapons, through the simple, brutal arithmetic of competitiveness. Britain learned this lesson between 1975 and 1990. The workshop of the world became the museum of the world in a single generation. In 1975, Britain still manufactured 25% of the world's steel, 15% of global chemicals, 12% of automobiles. British factories employed 7.1 million workers. Manufacturing represented 30% of GDP. Heavy industry dominated the landscape from Sheffield to Birmingham, from Glasgow to Manchester. The British pound was still a reserve currency. London remained the center of global finance. The empire had ended, but the industrial core seemed permanent. British engineering was respected globally. British manufacturing standards were benchmarks. Then the mathematics changed. North Sea oil production peaked in 1981. Energy costs, which had been artificially suppressed, began rising toward market rates. Industrial electricity prices doubled between 1979 and 1983. Natural gas costs tripled. The foundation of cheap energy that had supported heavy industry for decades disappeared. Margaret Thatcher's government made a choice. Instead of subsidizing failing industries, instead of protecting inefficient producers, they chose to let market forces decide. They called it creative destruction. They said inefficient capacity needed to be cleared so that competitive industries could emerge. The result was the fastest deindustrialization in modern history. Steel production fell from 20 million tons annually to 7 million tons by 1990. Coal mining, which employed 200,000 workers in 1980, employed 8,000 by 1995. Shipbuilding virtually disappeared. The answer to Germany's current industrial struggle became crystal clear during the 2008 financial crisis when we compared it to Britain. Back then, Britain's economy contracted far more severely than Germany's, even though Germany was heavily exposed to the global manufacturing downturn. Britain's recovery took longer and its recession was deeper. Why? Because when your economy depends on financial flows rather than actual production, you become incredibly vulnerable to shocks in confidence. But there's a deeper issue. Britain had lost its ability to respond to economic challenges by increasing production. When your economy is primarily financial, your main response to a crisis is monetary. You can't produce your way out of a recession. You can only print your way out. And printing money has serious consequences: currency debasement, asset bubbles, soaring wealth inequality, social tensions, and political instability. The numbers don't lie. By 2020, Britain's industrial production was 15% below its 1990 level. In stark contrast, Germany's was 40% above its 1990 level. One economy had kept its productive capacity, while the other had financialized it away. Brexit wasn't the cause of Britain's economic problems, it was a symptom. It was the political outcry from an economy that had lost its productive foundation and was desperately trying to maintain living standards through financial engineering alone. Now, fast forward to today. Germany is facing the exact same choice Britain faced in the 1980s. The same math, the same pressures. But Germany's situation is far more complex and much more dangerous. Germany's industrial economy is larger, more integrated, and more systemically important to global supply chains than Britain's ever was. When German industry falters, it doesn't just hurt Germany. It threatens the entire European project. It disrupts global automotive supply chains, and it impacts chemical and pharmaceutical production worldwide. And unlike Britain in the 80s, Germany doesn't have North Sea oil. It doesn't have a robust nuclear power sector. It has no domestic energy resources to fall back on. Its entire industrial model was built on 3 pillars: cheap Russian gas, reliable supply chains, and global free trade. All 3 of those pillars have now crumbled. Let me show you exactly how the math works, how high energy costs translate into industrial death. It's how competitive advantage vanishes, and how decades of built-up capability can evaporate in just a few months. In 2020, German industrial electricity prices averaged about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. By late 2022, they had skyrocketed to 50 cents per kilowatt hour. That's a 12-fold increase. Imagine your factory's power bill increasing by 12 times. For an aluminum smelter, where electricity is 40% of the total production cost, a 12-fold price hike makes production economically impossible. Not just difficult, impossible. The numbers simply don't add up. For chemical manufacturing, energy is 35% of production costs. For steel, it's 30%. Paper, 25%. These industries cannot absorb such a massive increase in their primary input cost. They have 2 choices: shut down or relocate. And that's exactly what we saw happen. Aluminum Dunkerque, Europe's largest aluminum smelter, shut down operations in November 2022. Norsk Hydro closed smelting capacity in Slovakia. Alcoa shuttered its operations in Spain. These weren't temporary shutdowns, they were permanent closures. What makes this so devastating is that aluminum smelting requires specialized infrastructure that takes years and huge capital investment to build. Once you shut down a smelter, restarting it costs almost as much as building a new one. And if energy prices stay high, there's zero economic reason to even try. The chemical manufacturing industry faces the same grim reality. Take BASF's Ludwigshafen complex, the largest chemical manufacturing site in the world. It produces 45,000 different products, employs 39,000 people directly, and supports another 100,000 jobs in the surrounding area. That entire complex was designed around cheap natural gas, not just as fuel, but as a raw material. Natural gas provides the hydrogen and carbon needed for petrochemical production. When gas prices increased tenfold, the entire production model became uneconomical overnight. The heart of German industry is facing a choice between survival and collapse, and the world is watching. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis insightful, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the global economy. BASF announced it would permanently reduce production capacity at Ludwigshafen by 25%. 25% of the world's largest chemical complex, gone. Production would shift to facilities in China, where gas prices remain low and electricity was cheap. But chemical manufacturing is not just about chemicals. It's about intermediate products that support every other industry. Plastics, solvents, adhesives, coatings, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals. When chemical production migrates, it takes the supply chain with it. German automotive manufacturers suddenly faced supply chain costs that were 30-40% higher than their competitors in China and the United States. Not because German workers were less productive, not because German engineering was inferior, because the input costs for production had become uncompetitive. And automotive manufacturing amplifies these effects through multiplier chains. When Volkswagen reduces production in Germany, it affects parts suppliers, logistics companies, service providers, construction firms, restaurants, retail shops. The industrial ecosystem begins contracting. Regional economies that developed around manufacturing centers start dying. Wolfsburg exists because of Volkswagen. Ingolstadt exists because of Audi. Stuttgart exists because of Mercedes and Porsche. When automotive production migrates, these cities lose their economic foundation. But the automotive sector reveals something even more profound about Germany's industrial crisis, something that extends far beyond energy costs. The transition to electric vehicles requires a completely different industrial ecosystem than internal combustion engines. Different materials, different manufacturing processes, different supply chains. And that ecosystem is concentrated in China. China controls 85% of global rare earth element processing, 75% of lithium refining, 65% of cobalt processing, 60% of graphite production. These materials are essential for electric vehicle batteries. Without access to Chinese supply chains, European electric vehicle production is impossible. But China is not just a raw material supplier. Chinese companies have achieved technological leadership in battery manufacturing, electric motors, and power electronics. KTL and BYD produce better batteries at lower costs than any European competitor. When Tesla builds electric vehicles in Berlin, they import battery cells from China. When BMW produces electric vehicles in Munich, they source batteries from Chinese suppliers. German automotive companies have become assembly operations for Chinese components. This is not temporary competitive disadvantage. This is structural technological displacement. The same pattern appears across German industrial sectors. Machine tools, where Germany once dominated globally, now face competition from Chinese manufacturers that offer comparable quality at 40% lower prices. Not because Chinese labor is cheaper, because Chinese manufacturing has achieved scale advantages and supply chain integration that European producers cannot match. Renewable energy equipment tells the same story. Germany was the global leader in solar panel manufacturing in the early 2000s. Q-Cells, SolarWorld, Conergy were world-class companies with advanced technology and strong export markets. Today, Chinese companies control 85% of global solar panel production. German solar manufacturers either went bankrupt or relocated production to Asia. The entire industry migrated in less than 15 years. The pattern repeats in wind energy, where Chinese companies now dominate turbine manufacturing. In industrial automation, where Chinese companies challenged traditional German leaders like Siemens and Bosch. In telecommunications equipment, where Huawei and ZTE have displaced European competitors. This is not unfair competition. This is not dumping. This is not subsidized production. This is industrial evolution. When one economy achieves systematic cost and technological advantages, production migrates. Capital follows opportunity. Expertise follows capital. And once migration begins, it accelerates through network effects. When chemical production moves from Germany to China, the engineers move too. The process knowledge transfers. The supply relationships shift. The innovation centers relocate. What took Germany decades to build gets replicated in China within years. But China benefits from later mover advantage. They build newer facilities with more efficient technology. They integrate processes more effectively. They achieve scale more quickly. They learn from German mistakes while avoiding German legacy costs. The result is not just cost competitiveness, it's technological superiority. Chinese chemical facilities now operate with higher efficiency, lower emissions, and better safety records than older German plants. Chinese automotive factories achieve higher productivity and quality metrics than traditional European operations. Germany is not losing industrial competitiveness because German workers are less skilled. German workers remain among the most productive in the world. Germany is losing because the entire framework of industrial competition has shifted. Energy costs, supply chain access, scale advantages, technological evolution, regulatory compliance costs. These factors now matter more than traditional advantages like engineering expertise and manufacturing experience. And Germany cannot address these challenges through policy adjustments or subsidies. The competitive gaps are too large. The cost disadvantages are too systematic. The technological transitions are too fundamental. This is what industrial decline looks like in the modern global economy. Not gradual erosion, rapid displacement, but Germany's industrial crisis extends beyond manufacturing competitiveness. It reflects deeper structural problems with the European economic model itself. The European Union was designed for a world of stable energy prices, free trade, and technological leadership in traditional industries. That world no longer exists. Energy prices are now permanently higher because of geopolitical tensions and climate transition costs. Free trade has been replaced by strategic competition and supply chain localization. Technological leadership has migrated to economies with better access to critical materials and larger domestic markets. Germany faces a choice: adapt to this new reality or continue declining within the old framework. Adaptation means accepting that heavy industry will migrate, that chemical manufacturing, steel production, aluminum smelting, and automotive assembly will increasingly occur elsewhere. That Germany's economic model must transition from industrial production to something else. But transition to what? Financial services, like Britain? But Frankfurt cannot replicate London's advantages in global finance. Technology services, like Ireland? But Germany lacks the corporate tax advantages and English language accessibility. High-end manufacturing, like Switzerland? But Germany's industrial base is too large to specialize in niche markets. The alternatives are limited, and all of them involve accepting lower living standards for the majority of the population, because industrial jobs paid middle-class wages to workers without advanced education. Service economy jobs either require specialized skills or provide basic services at low wages. When German automotive factories close, the workers transition to logistics, retail, food service, healthcare, jobs that pay 30-40% less. This is the universal pattern of deindustrialization. Average wages fall, income inequality increases, regional economies collapse, social cohesion fractures. And Germany's social model cannot function without the industrial base that funded it. German corporations pay some of the highest tax rates in the world. All of this was sustainable when German industry was globally competitive. But if industry migrates, the entire model becomes unsustainable. This is not a German problem. This is a European problem. And ultimately, it's a Western problem. The United States faces similar challenges. Japan struggles with the same competitive pressures. Recognition comes slowly. Adjustment takes years. Germany today stands where Britain stood in 1980. History suggests the outcome is predetermined. Industrial capacity flows to the most competitive locations, regardless of government policy. The only question is whether the transition happens gradually or through crisis. Current indicators suggest the transition will not be gradual. German industrial production continues declining. Energy prices remain structurally elevated. Meanwhile, political pressure grows to maintain industrial employment through subsidies. But resistance to economic gravity creates tension, and tension eventually releases through crisis. Industrial empires do not decline gracefully. They fight to preserve advantages that have already disappeared. And then, suddenly, the accumulated tensions release, not through gradual adjustment, through systemic breakdown. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more content on the global economy. The British industrial decline of the 1980s led to social unrest, political upheaval, and regional economic collapse that lasted decades. The American industrial decline of the 2000s contributed to political polarization, social fragmentation, and institutional breakdown. Germany's industrial decline will follow a similar pattern unless the transition is managed more skillfully than previous examples suggest is possible. Because deindustrialization is not just economic restructuring, it's social transformation. It changes how societies function, how politics operate, how people understand their place in the world. When work disappears, when communities collapse, when traditional pathways to prosperity no longer exist, people look for explanations, for someone to blame, for simple solutions to complex problems. And history shows where those searches typically lead. The mathematics of German deindustrialization are not complicated. Energy costs have made heavy industry uncompetitive. Supply chain dependencies have created strategic vulnerabilities. Technological transitions have shifted advantages to other economies. These trends will continue regardless of policy responses. Industrial production will migrate to locations with structural advantages. Investment will follow competitiveness. Employment will adjust to economic realities. The only uncertainty is timing. Industrial systems can operate at losses for months or years before shutting down permanently. Government subsidies can delay closure decisions. Corporate reserves can sustain uneconomical operations temporarily. But economic gravity always wins. Subsidies run out, reserves deplete, political patience exhausts. And when the support systems finally fail, the adjustment happens rapidly. Not over years, over months. German industry is not dying because of policy mistakes or geopolitical accidents. German industry is dying because the global economic environment has shifted in ways that make German industrial production structurally uncompetitive. This is not temporary disruption. This is permanent transition. Empires built on industrial production do not survive when industrial production becomes uneconomical. They adapt or they decline, they transform or they collapse. And history suggests that when economic transitions happen under crisis conditions, they rarely happen well. The patterns are not new. We have seen them before. The only question is whether we recognize them before recognition becomes irrelevant. Resource dependencies become weapons. Industrial advantages become disadvantages. Economic models become unsustainable. And the transition from prosperity to decline accelerates until stopping it is no longer possible. That is how empires end, not through conquest, through arithmetic.